June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m. Central Pacific Ocean. The sea stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of broken clouds, its surface rippling under a mild wind that carried the smell of salt and fuel oil. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, his eyes scanning the horizon where sky met water in a hazy line of pale blue. Around him, the organized chaos of naval aviation unfolded like a carefully rehearsed ballet. Mechanics wrestling with bomb carts, pilots checking instrument panels, deck crews shouting coordinates over the roar of idling engines. The morning sun, already climbing toward its zenith, cast sharp shadows across the wooden planks, still damp from the night's spray. In his hand, Fuchida clutched a navigation chart marked with penciled calculations, his fingers stained with graphite and sweat. 6 months earlier, he had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 months earlier, the Empire had seemed invincible. Now, somewhere beyond that horizon, American carriers hunted in the vast emptiness, and the air itself felt heavy with something unnamed, something that tasted like copper and uncertainty. The Akagi was not alone. Flanking her to port and starboard steamed 3 sister carriers, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, each a floating city of steel and ambition, each bearing the weight of Japan's imperial destiny on her flight deck. Together, they formed the Kido Butai, the striking force that had terrorized the Pacific for half a year, leaving burning harbors and shattered fleets in its wake. Their hulls cut through the water with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat, their battle flags snapping in the breeze like the tongues of dragons. But below those decks, in the dimly lit hangars where ordnance crews worked by the glow of caged bulbs, a different scene played out. Planes sat wing to wing, their bellies hung with torpedoes intended for enemy ships, while nearby carts overflowed with high-explosive bombs meant for land targets. The armament had been changed once already that morning, then changed back, a dance of indecision that left ammunition scattered across the deck like discarded thoughts. Time, that most patient of enemies, was running out. Fuchida did not know, could not know, that 5 minutes of hell approached faster than any man could calculate. 5 minutes that would erase 6 months of victory. If 5 minutes that would transform the entire war in the Pacific from a story of Japanese conquest into a chronicle of American resurgence. 5 minutes, measured not in seconds, but in the screaming descent of dive bombers, the eruption of munitions, and the death throes of an empire's naval supremacy. The Americans were coming, and they were coming from the sun. To understand what happened in those 5 minutes, one must first understand what had come before. Japan's entry into the Second World War had been marked by a string of victories so complete, so devastating, that they seemed to confirm the nation's divine destiny. On December 7, 1941, Fuchida himself had circled above Pearl Harbor and radioed the code words, "Tora! Tora! Tora! Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. 8 American battleships had burned or sunk that morning. Simultaneously, Japanese forces struck the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Malaya. Within weeks, Hong Kong fell. Within months, Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress of British power in Asia, surrendered after a campaign that humiliated Western colonial authority. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. Burma was overrun. The rising sun flew over an empire stretching from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific atolls, an empire built in barely 6 months of warfare. The architects of this expansion, particularly Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, understood the mathematics of their gamble. Japan's industrial capacity could not match America's potential. The United States possessed greater steel production, greater oil reserves, greater manufacturing capability in every category that mattered for modern war. Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, knew the American character better than most of his colleagues. He had walked American streets, toured American factories, watched American workers pour from assembly lines at shift change. He had warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that a protracted conflict would end in certain defeat. The only hope, slim, dangerous, but possible, was to deliver such devastating blows early that America would negotiate a settlement, conceding Japan's sphere of influence in Asia rather than endure years of costly warfare. Pearl Harbor was the first blow, and Midway was meant to be the second, a knockout punch aimed at eliminating America's remaining carrier strength and forcing negotiations. The plan called for the invasion of Midway Atoll itself, a tiny American outpost 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii. The atoll's capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, threaten Hawaii, and force the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond. When the American carriers sailed out to defend Midway, the Kido Butai would be waiting, ready to annihilate them in a decisive surface engagement. It was a plan built on the assumption of Japanese tactical superiority, on the belief that Japanese pilots, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Dutch East Indies, were simply better than their American counterparts. It was a plan that did not account for the possibility of failure. But failures compound when hidden from view. Japanese intelligence had failed to detect that American codebreakers, working in a basement at Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. Through thousands of hours of meticulous analysis, cross-referencing intercepted messages with known ship movements and geographic references, Rochefort's team had pieced together the outlines of the Midway operation. They knew the target. They knew the approximate timing. Most crucially, they knew the composition and planned route of the Japanese fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had intelligence that Japanese commanders assumed was impossible. The hunters had become the hunted, and they did not know it. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and in Yorktown, lay in wait northeast of Midway, positioned to ambush the Japanese strike force. The Yorktown should not even have been there. She had limped into Pearl Harbor with severe damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, her flight deck torn and her hull compromised. Navy engineers estimated 3 months for repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Round-the-clock work crews swarmed the ship, welding, riveting, patching, improvising. When she sailed on May 30th, civilian workers were still aboard, and some would remain through the coming battle. American desperation had produced a miracle of logistics, but Japanese intelligence reported the Yorktown sunk. Yamamoto believed he faced only 2 American carriers. He was wrong. The Japanese officers expected a repeat of their previous triumphs. Why would they not? So every engagement since Pearl Harbor had confirmed their tactical brilliance and material superiority. Their pilots were among the finest in the world, many with thousands of hours of combat experience over China. Their carriers represented the cutting edge of naval aviation, purpose-built vessels designed around air power rather than battleship-era thinking. The Zero fighter aircraft, with its extraordinary range and maneuverability, had dominated every opponent it encountered. Even the losses at Coral Sea, the light carrier Shoho sunk, the fleet carrier Shokaku damaged, and the carrier Zuikaku depleted of aircraft, seemed merely tactical setbacks in a strategic advance that had conquered half the Pacific. On the morning of June 4th, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai with the confidence of unbroken victory. Yet his carriers launched their first strike against Midway Atoll at 4:30 a.m., 108 aircraft tasked with neutralizing the island's defenses. The strike was successful enough, damaging installations and suppressing anti-aircraft positions, but the strike leader radioed back that a second attack would be necessary. Nagumo faced a decision. His reserve aircraft, 93 planes spotted on deck, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, were configured for anti-ship operations. If he committed them to a second strike on Midway, He would need to rearm them with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. But somewhere out there, American carriers might be lurking. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his choice. Rearm for the Midway strike. The hangar decks erupted into frantic activity as crews removed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, wheeling them aside to make room for high-explosive ordnance and incendiaries. The work was tedious, time-consuming. Proper procedure required lowering the removed munitions into armored magazines below deck. But time pressed. Deck crews, urged to haste, left torpedoes and bombs sitting in hangar spaces and alongside the flight deck, ready to be rehung once the Midway strike returned and the second wave launched. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, reported contact with American ships. Nagumo's blood went cold. How many ships? What types? The scout's initial message was maddeningly vague. Nagumo suspended the rearming operation. Minutes ticked by like hours. At 7:45 a.m., another message. The enemy force included what appeared to be a carrier. One carrier. Nagumo's calculations shifted again. He could still win this. But he needed his aircraft armed for ship attack, and he needed to recover the Midway strike group now returning low on fuel. The decision paralyzed him. Rearm again for anti-ship? Wait for the Midway planes to land? Launch immediately with whatever he had ready? He chose caution. Recover the Midway strike first, then launch a massive, properly coordinated strike against the American carrier. It was the professional decision, the tactically sound decision. It was also the decision that would cost him everything. The Midway strike began landing at 8:37 a.m. Fighters touched down, folded their wings, and were immediately struck below to make deck space. Bombers and torpedo planes followed in sequence, their crews haggard from combat and defensive fire over the atoll. Meanwhile, far above, American torpedo bombers were already beginning their attacks. The Americans had found the Kido Butai at 9:20 a.m. What followed was a series of uncoordinated, piecemeal attacks that showcased both the courage and chaos of American naval aviation in 1942. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, 15 TBD Devastator aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked first without fighter escort. The Devastator was already obsolete, slow, poorly armored, carrying a torpedo that frequently malfunctioned. Against the wall of anti-aircraft fire and the screen of Zero fighters protecting the carriers, Waldron's squadron was annihilated. Every aircraft was shot down. Of the 30 men aboard those 15 planes, 29 died. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water amid burning wreckage, watching the battle unfold from the surface. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next, losing 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed, losing 10 of 12. In less than an hour, American torpedo bombers had been slaughtered without landing a single successful hit. Japanese pilots and anti-aircraft gunners had performed exactly as their training and experience predicted, ruthlessly, efficiently, lethally. On the decks of the carriers below, officers watched the American planes plunge into the sea, trailing smoke and fire, and some must have felt that familiar surge of confidence, that sense of inevitable triumph. The Americans were brave, certainly. But bravery without skill was merely another word for suicide. What the Japanese officers did not see, could not see, was the consequence of those failed attacks. Every American torpedo bomber that pressed in low, skimming the wave tops to deliver its payload, pulled the Japanese defensive screen downward. Zeros swarmed to intercept threats at sea level. Anti-aircraft gunners trained their weapons horizontally. Eyes tracked the obvious threats, the slow, lumbering torpedo planes that posed the greatest danger to the carriers' hulls. No one was looking up. 10:22 a.m., June 4th, 1942. The dive bombers came from the sun. 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft from Enterprise and Yorktown split into two groups and arrived simultaneously over the Japanese fleet through nothing more than chance and fortune, the kind of chance that men later called destiny. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had led his squadrons on an extended search after failing to find the Japanese at their predicted location. Low on fuel, gambling his pilots' lives on instinct and tactical reasoning, he had turned north and followed the heading of a lone Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main force. That decision put him over the Kido Butai at the exact moment that Yorktown's bombers, approaching from a different vector, also made contact. The Japanese carriers steamed in a rough box formation, turning into the wind to launch their strike against the American carriers. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, fighters, bombers, but torpedo planes, all fully fueled, many armed, spotted for launch in tight rows that maximized the speed of getting them airborne. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Ordnance carts stood nearby. In the hangars below, torpedoes and bombs that had been removed during the rearming confusion sat unprotected, their explosive charges primed. Every carrier was a floating bomb, waiting for the spark. McCluskey's dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs at approximately 10:22 a.m. The Dauntless was designed for this moment, a stable platform that could dive at steep angles, absorbing punishing G-forces while the pilot fought to keep the target centered in his bomb sight. From 14,000 feet, the Japanese carriers looked like toy ships, their wakes white scars on the dark Pacific. Then the dive began, the altimeter unwinding. Hit the wind screaming past the perforated dive brakes, the target growing from a toy to a ship to a world that filled the entire bomb site. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, black flowers of flak blooming in empty air, but the Zeros were still at sea level, still chasing torpedo bombers that no longer existed. The sky above belonged to the Americans. The first bomb struck Akagi at 10:26 a.m., penetrating the flight deck midships and detonating in the upper hangar. The explosion ignited aircraft fuel and triggered secondary blasts from stored ordnance. Within seconds, the hangar was an inferno. A second bomb hit near the amidships elevator, blowing it completely off its frame and sending twisted steel skyward. Fire raced through the ship's interior, fed by fuel from ruptured aviation gas lines and ammunition from hastily stored bombs and torpedoes. Damage control parties rushed forward, but the ship's internal fire suppression systems had been damaged in the initial blasts. Commander Fuchida, recovering from an appendectomy performed at sea just days earlier, was blown off his feet by the concussion. When he regained consciousness, the flagship of Japan's carrier force was already dying. Kaga absorbed 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. One struck among the aircraft spotted on the forward flight deck, creating a massive fireball that swept across the deck crews and ignited every plane in its path. Another penetrated into the hangar, where it detonated among torpedo bombers being rearmed. The torpedoes' warheads cooked off, each explosion triggering others in a cascading symphony of destruction. A third bomb struck near the island superstructure, killing most of the ship's senior officers instantly. Captain Jisaku Okada died at his post. Within minutes, the entire ship forward of the island was consumed by fire that burned with such intensity that steel buckled and deck plating glowed red. Soryu took 3 bombs in quick succession, all along the center line of her flight deck. The concentrated damage overwhelmed her damage control capabilities immediately. Fuel tanks ruptured, magazine spaces flooded with fire. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to abandon ship, lashing himself to the bridge as flames consumed the superstructure around him. His crew could hear him singing the Japanese national anthem, Kimigayo, as the fire took him. Below decks, engineering crews fought to maintain steam and power, but the ship's internal communications had been severed. Yet her pumps were failing, and the fire was spreading faster than any human effort could contain. 3 carriers, 5 minutes. The math was brutal and inescapable. The careful orchestration of Japanese naval power, the coordination between carriers, the mutual support of air wings, the concentration of force that had made the Kido Butai invincible, all of it evaporated in the time it took a man to smoke a cigarette. Japanese officers watched their sister ships burn with expressions that photographs would later capture. Shock, disbelief, a kind of numb incomprehension that this could be happening, that their superiority could vanish so completely in so little time. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been steaming apart from her sisters and escaped the initial strike. She immediately launched 2 counterattacks against the Yorktown, inflicting severe damage that would eventually send the American carrier to the bottom 3 days later, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. But Hiryu's reprieve lasted only hours. That afternoon, American dive bombers found her alone and unprotected. 4 bombs struck home, and she joined her sisters in burning. By evening, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were blazing wrecks, their fires visible for miles across the darkening Pacific. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, though the formal conclusion would not come until the following day, when Hiryu finally sank. In the years that followed, Japanese officers who survived Midway struggled to explain what had happened. How could American torpedo bombers, antiquated, poorly coordinated, slaughtered wholesale, have contributed to victory? How could dive bombers, on arriving by what appeared to be sheer luck, have destroyed in 5 minutes what had taken years to build? The explanations varied. Some cited the rearming confusion, the delays, the scout plane from Tone launching late. Some blamed Nagumo's indecision or the absence of adequate fighter cover overhead. Some pointed to American code breaking or the element of surprise. All these factors mattered. But beneath the tactical particulars lay a deeper truth that few Japanese officers wanted to acknowledge. They had encountered an enemy who, despite inferior equipment and less training, had adapted faster, improvised better, and embraced a level of decentralized initiative that Japanese military culture struggled to match. American naval aviation in 1942 was a study in creative chaos. Pilots trained for months rather than years. The aircraft were often outdated. Coordination between squadrons was frequently poor, but American doctrine emphasized individual initiative in a way that Japanese training did not. When plans fell apart, when radio communication failed or air groups became separated or fuel ran dangerously low, American squadron commanders made independent decisions based on their assessment of the situation. McCluskey's turn north, following that lone destroyer on nothing but intuition, was not in any battle plan. It was an act of tactical creativity born from a culture that rewarded such thinking rather than punishing it as a deviation from orders. Moreover, the Americans possessed one critical advantage that transcended tactics or technology: strategic depth. The loss of Yorktown hurt. But American shipyards were already laying down new carriers in numbers that Japan could never match. The pilots killed at Midway were mourned, but American training programs were graduating new aviators every week. Japan's industrial base simply could not replace what was lost. The 4 carriers destroyed at Midway represented not just ships, but irreplaceable expertise: veteran crew members, experienced pilots, skilled deck handlers. Japan would build new carriers, but it could not rebuild the human capital that burned in those 5 minutes. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese recollections of Midway was not a weapon or a piece of technology. It was time. Time to rearm aircraft. Time to recover the Midway strike group. Time to coordinate a proper counterattack. At every decision point, Nagumo felt the pressure of time slipping away, and in trying to manage it, he lost it entirely. The Americans, by contrast, had surrendered to time's flow. Their torpedo bombers attacked in piecemeal fashion because they arrived piecemeal, unable to coordinate. But that very lack of coordination meant the attacks came in waves, each pulling the Japanese defensive screen lower until the dive bombers arrived overhead in the gap. What appeared to be American disorganization was in retrospect a kind of accidental brilliance, or perhaps evidence that in war, chaos itself can become a weapon when embraced rather than feared. The fires aboard the carriers burned through the afternoon and into the night. Destroyers circled the stricken vessels, playing searchlights across water choked with debris and swimming men. Rescue operations continued for hours, was pulling survivors from the oil-slicked sea, but hundreds of men went down with their ships. The Akagi lingered until the early hours of June 5th, when Japanese destroyers finally put her under with torpedoes to prevent capture. The Kaga sank first, disappearing beneath the waves at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th. The Soryu followed at 7:13 p.m. the same day. The Hiryu, tough and defiant to the end, burned until the morning of June 5th before finally sinking at 9:12 a.m. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the overall operation from the battleship Yamato 300 miles to the rear, received the reports with the stoicism expected of a samurai. He had gambled on a decisive victory and lost. The Midway invasion was canceled. The fleet turned west, back toward Japan, carrying the survivors and the wounded and the knowledge that the war had fundamentally changed. Yamamoto would not live to see Japan surrender. His plane would be shot down over the Solomon Islands in April 1943, a victim of another intelligence intercept, another American ambush planned with meticulous care. But in the hours after Midway, he must have understood what many of his subordinates did not, that Japan's 6 months of running wild had ended, and the long, grinding war of attrition he had feared had begun. The American victory at Midway is often described as a turning point, the moment when the Pacific War's momentum shifted irrevocably. This is true, but incomplete. Midway did not end the war. 3 more years of brutal fighting lay ahead. Japanese forces would defend their conquests with suicidal determination, while making the Americans pay in blood for every island, every airfield, every mile of advance. But Midway ended the possibility of Japanese victory. It closed off the narrow path that might have led to a negotiated settlement favorable to Tokyo. After Midway, the outcome was no longer in doubt, only the duration and the cost. For the dive bomber pilots who delivered those fatal blows, the experience was both triumphant and nightmarish. Many reported feeling no elation as they watched Japanese carriers explode beneath them, only a grim satisfaction and an overwhelming desire to survive long enough to land back on their own carriers. Some ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean, waiting hours for rescue. Some were killed by anti-aircraft fire during their dives, their planes cartwheeling into the sea. Yet those who returned found their carriers engaged in frantic recovery operations, landing signal officers waving them aboard even as enemy aircraft attacked nearby. The chaos continued until darkness fell and the shooting finally stopped. In the decades since, historians and military analysts have dissected the Battle of Midway with academic precision, examining every decision, every factor, every variable. The consensus is that Midway was winnable for either side until those 5 minutes. Had the Japanese scout plane from Tone launched on time, had Nagumo held back his reserve aircraft armed for ship attack, had the American dive bombers arrived 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later, the outcome might have been entirely different. But history is written by the choices actually made, not the alternatives that might have been. So 5 minutes decided the Pacific War. 5 minutes proved that even the most dominant military force is vulnerable when caught at the wrong moment. 5 minutes taught a generation of officers that in modern warfare, the advantage can shift faster than human comprehension can follow. The sun set over the Pacific on June 4, 1942. painting the smoke from burning carriers in shades of orange and crimson and purple. The wind carried the smell of burning oil and chemicals and flesh across the water, a stench that clung to the men on the surviving ships and haunted their dreams for years afterward. The Japanese fleet withdrew in darkness, diminished and bloodied, carrying home the wounded and the dead and the heavy knowledge of defeat. The American fleet, exhausted and low on fuel, did not pursue. They had won, but they did not yet understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished. In Tokyo, news of the disaster was suppressed. The government announced a great victory, claiming the destruction of multiple American carriers while minimizing Japanese losses. Wounded veterans from Midway were quarantined upon their return, forbidden from speaking about what they had witnessed. The families of the dead were told their sons and husbands had perished gloriously in a victorious battle. It would be years before the Japanese public learned the truth, and even then, many refused to believe it. How could 4 carriers, the pride of the fleet, the victors of Pearl Harbor, have been destroyed so quickly? How could trained, experienced pilots and crews have been overwhelmed by an American force that seemed inferior in every measurable category? Yet the answer lay partly in material factors, code breaking, positioning, timing, but also in something less tangible. The Americans had fought with a kind of improvised desperation that Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on rigid planning and hierarchical authority, struggled to counter. When American plans disintegrated, individual commanders made decisions. When coordination failed, they attacked anyway. When their equipment proved inadequate, they pressed on through sheer determination. It was not elegant, it was not efficient, but in the crucible of combat, it was enough. The recurring symbol that emerges from Midway is not a weapon or a machine, but a moment. That instant when the dive bombers pushed over, when gravity and momentum took control, when the pilot became merely a guiding hand on machinery committed to its descent. Yet in that moment, everything that came before, the training, the fear, the planning, the luck, crystallized into a single point of impact. The bomb either hit or missed. The target either survived or burned. War, which seems in the abstract to be about grand strategy and national will, revealed itself to be a series of such moments, each one a collision between human intention and physical reality, each one irreversible and absolute. The Japanese officers who survived Midway carried those moments with them for the rest of their lives. Some wrote memoirs trying to explain what had happened, seeking patterns in the chaos. Some retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to articulate the experience of watching everything they had believed in. Their training, their superiority, their destiny, consumed in fire. Some, like Commander Fuchida, yet survived the war and lived long enough to see Japan rebuild as a prosperous democracy, allied with the very nation that had defeated it. In old age, Fuchida became a Christian missionary, traveling to America to preach reconciliation and forgiveness, an irony so profound it seems almost novelistic. The man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, standing in American churches. Speaking of peace, history is full of such transformations, but they never cease to astonish. The Pacific Ocean that witnessed Midway continues its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the dramas played out upon its surface. The wrecks of the 4 Japanese carriers rest on the bottom, nearly 3 miles down, tombs for the men who went down with them. In 1999, an expedition located the Kaga, her hull broken but recognizable, a ghost ship lying in the abyss. But other expeditions have found the Akagi and the Soryu and the Hiryu, each one a monument to the brevity of triumph and the permanence of consequence. The American carrier Yorktown lies nearby, separated from her enemies by a few miles of ocean floor, all of them participants in a battle that lasted 2 days but echoed through decades. The lessons of Midway are taught in military academies around the world, case studies in intelligence, timing, decision-making under uncertainty, and the role of chance in war. Analysts debate whether Nagumo made the right decisions or whether different choices could have saved his carriers. They argue about whether McCluskey's decision to turn north was brilliant intuition or merely fortunate guesswork. They construct alternative histories in which the Japanese won, imagining a Pacific dominated by Tokyo, and a World War II that ended differently. These exercises are valuable for understanding military dynamics, but they miss the human element, the terror of the dive, the chaos of the burning hangar deck, the cold water of the Pacific closing over a man's head as his ship sinks beneath him. 5 minutes changed the war because 5 minutes revealed the fundamental truth that technology, training, and experience, while important, are never sufficient guarantees of victory. They must be applied at the right time, in the right place, under the right conditions. The Japanese had the technology, better carriers, better fighters, better torpedoes than the Americans in many cases. They had the training, pilots with thousands of hours of combat experience. They had the experience, 6 months of unbroken victories. But they did not have the right moment. And in war, the moment is everything. The Americans, by contrast, arrived at the right moment through a combination of intelligence, determination, and luck. They had cracked the Japanese code. They had positioned their carriers perfectly. They had launched their strikes in a sequence that, while uncoordinated, created the conditions for success. And when the moment came, their pilots did not hesitate. They pushed over into their dives knowing that anti-aircraft fire would shred some of them, that mechanical failure would claim others, that the odds of survival were poor. They did it anyway. That willingness to act decisively in the face of overwhelming risk, that capacity to function effectively even when plans collapse. These qualities, more than any technology or tactic, determined the outcome at Midway. The battle also illustrated a profound truth about industrial warfare, that nations with greater productive capacity can afford to learn from their mistakes, while nations with limited resources cannot. America lost pilots and planes and ships at Midway, but the losses were absorbed by a vast industrial machine that replaced them within months. Japan lost pilots and planes and ships at Midway, and while new ships were built and new pilots were trained, they never fully recovered the edge they had possessed. Each subsequent battle depleted Japan's finite reserves a little more, while America's reserves grew. The mathematics were inexorable. Midway accelerated the process, but the underlying dynamic was already in place. In the end, what remains is the image of those carriers burning. 4 floating cities of steel and ambition reduced to funeral pyres in 5 minutes of fury. The smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible to pilots from both sides, a column of black that marked the death of Japanese naval supremacy as clearly as any gravestone. The men who survived the sinkings, pulled from the water by destroyers or rescued after hours adrift, carried the memory of that smoke for the rest of their lives. It appeared in their dreams, in their waking thoughts, in the stories they told or refused to tell. It became a symbol of impermanence, of the fragility of power, of the speed with which dominance can turn to defeat. The American pilots who delivered those bombs returned to their carriers as heroes, though many did not feel heroic. They felt lucky, and they felt relieved. They felt the weight of absent friends who had not returned. In the ready rooms and mess halls, they told their stories with the dark humor of men who have survived something they should not have survived, making jokes about running out of fuel or nearly missing the carriers entirely. But beneath the humor was an awareness that they had participated in something historic, that the bombs they released had done more than sink ships. They had altered the trajectory of the war, perhaps of history itself. For the Japanese officers who witnessed the destruction, the experience was transformative in a different way. They had entered the battle with absolute confidence, believing in their superiority, trusting their training and equipment and the record of unbroken victory. They left the battle, those who left it, with that confidence shattered. Some adapted, becoming more cautious, more defensive, trying to preserve what remained. Some doubled down, advocating for even more aggressive tactics, believing that one more decisive victory could restore the balance. Some simply broke under the weight of understanding that everything they had believed was contingent, that dominance was temporary, that war was not a story of destiny, but of chance and consequence colliding in the span of 5 minutes. The broader truth that Midway revealed was about democracy itself, about the character of societies engaged in total war. Japan's military culture emphasized unity, hierarchy, obedience, values that produced cohesion and discipline but sometimes stifled initiative. America's military culture, yes, reflecting the democratic society from which it emerged, was messier, more contentious, more willing to tolerate independent decision-making. That tolerance for chaos, that willingness to let squadron commanders make critical decisions without higher approval, proved decisive at Midway. The torpedo bomber pilots who pressed their attacks without fighter cover, the dive bomber commander who turned north on instinct, the carrier captains who launched strikes without complete coordination, all acted with a degree of autonomy that Japanese doctrine struggled to match. The result was a kind of creative disorder that, in the crucible of combat, proved more adaptable than rigid planning. This does not mean democracy guarantees military victory or that authoritarian systems cannot adapt. History provides counterexamples to any such simple formula. But at Midway, on that June day in 1942, the characteristics often associated with democratic societies, individual initiative, decentralized decision-making, tolerance for improvisation, manifested in ways that proved tactically decisive. The 5 minutes that sank 4 carriers were the product of thousands of individual decisions made by pilots, navigators, mechanics, intelligence officers, code breakers, and commanders, each one exercising judgment within their sphere of authority. The system that enabled and encouraged such judgments, rather than demanding lockstep adherence to a central plan, demonstrated its value in the most brutal way possible. Decades after the battle, survivors from both sides occasionally met at reunions and commemorative events, old men gathering to remember a day when they were young and at war. The conversations were often awkward, bridging, as they did, an immense gulf of language, culture, and historical memory. But there was also a shared understanding, a recognition that they had all participated in something larger than themselves, that the battle had shaped their lives in ways that transcended nationality or ideology. Japanese veterans spoke with grudging respect about American courage, about the dive bombers that came from the sun, about the torpedo pilots who pressed their attacks despite impossible odds. American veterans spoke with equal respect about Japanese seamanship, about the skill of Zero pilots, about the bravery of crews who stayed at their posts even as their ships burned around them. These reconciliations, these small moments of acknowledgement across the years, can suggest that the ultimate lesson of Midway may not be about tactics or technology or even national character. It may be about the nature of war itself, how quickly it transforms everything, how indifferent it is to human plans and expectations, how its outcomes depend on factors too numerous and complex for any commander to fully control. 5 minutes decided the Pacific War, but those 5 minutes were the culmination of 10,000 decisions, 100 unforeseen circumstances, a dozen instances of luck, both good and bad. To isolate any single cause, code breaking or dive bombers or Japanese indecision, is to miss the essential chaos, the irreducible complexity of combat. The Battle of Midway stands as a reminder that in war, as in life, there are moments when everything pivots. When the accumulated weight of past choices suddenly crystallizes into irrevocable consequence. The Japanese officers standing on the decks of doomed carriers, watching American bombs descend from the sky, experienced such a moment. They could not believe it was happening because their entire experience, their entire understanding of the war, told them it should not be happening. They were superior. They were more experienced. They had won every battle, and yet the bombs fell anyway, indifferent to their disbelief, transforming belief into burning wreckage. The Americans, watching from their own carriers as columns of smoke rose on the horizon, experienced the inverse, a moment when doubt transformed into realization, when desperate gambles resolved into improbable victory. They too struggled to believe what had happened. It's that their outdated planes and hastily trained pilots had destroyed the fleet that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. But the smoke proved it. The fires confirmed it. 5 minutes had rewritten the war, and so the battle ended, and the ships sailed away, and the dead were consigned to the depths, and the living carried the memory forward into all the battles yet to come. The war would continue for 3 more years, claiming millions more lives, devastating cities and nations, before finally ending in the atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the path to that ending, the trajectory from Japanese conquest to American victory, was established at Midway in 5 minutes of violence that no one could have predicted and no one would ever forget. The Japanese officers who survived learned that dominance is temporary, that empires are fragile, that war is a ruthless teacher. The Americans learned that persistence matters, that courage under impossible odds is not futile, that 5 minutes can change everything. The ocean keeps its secrets, but the wrecks on the seafloor testify to truths about power and time and the limits of human control. They rest there still, monuments to a battle that lasted 5 minutes, but echoes still. A reminder that history is made not in grand pronouncements or inevitable trajectories, but in moments. Brief, violent, irreversible moments when everything changes and nothing is ever the same again.